I first of all appreciate everyone who gave up this part of this gorgeous Sunday afternoon, and the part of the Masters too. I just checked. Bubba is leading by a stroke, so I'll try to give you updates if I can for those of you who want that. This is a terrific turnout, a wonderful topic. I couldn't be happier to be back in my hometown. I grew up in Indian Trail Road, family of 9, and we used to ride our bikes out here to Whitworth. This was the frontier. I mean, this was like we were falling off the map going to Canada when we came out here. You still are going to Canada when you come out here, so nothing's changed in that regard. I'm going to tell you 2 stories that merge into one story, and I hope I can give you a little bit of perspective. I love, and thank you so much for the County Library Association and Ellen and everyone for doing this, because this is a fantastic topic, because I have 2 takeaway points being so privileged in being the person who got to bring this story to a larger audience and sharing it from folks who lived through it. In one respect, this story is a fantastic fable, a fable of the earth and how you use it, how you abuse it, how you use it, what happens when it turns on you. The other part of this story is your topic. It's hope in hard times. It's human resilience. It's how much crap can any human being take? How much can the earth throw at you? How much can the economic system break down? How can you actually go hungry to the point where some people had to give up your kids and still come out at the other end, seeing the world and humanity in a not necessarily a bad light? Now, my journey to this started with people in their 90s. Unfortunately, almost all the folks I interviewed are gone now. Remember, the Dust Bowl happened 75 years ago. So if you were alive then, you were probably in your teens, or at the most, in your 20s, your low 20s. And I was so privileged I would go from town to town in the panhandle of Texas, in western Kansas, in the Oklahoma panhandle, what most Americans now call flyover country, or the Big Empty, or it was, for a while on the map, it actually was called No Man's Land. That was the formal name of the Oklahoma Panhandle. It was called the Great American Desert. And I would go from town to town, and it was always the same story. Dying town, full of elderly folks. Young people had fled. There wasn't a restaurant left. There wasn't a school that had held a kid for 50 years. And I would sit and hear these stories, and they would just almost make me weep. And they were people, again, in their 90s, and I was sitting in a little semicircle. And I've said this before, but it's true. I wasn't looking at, after a while, at somebody in their 90s. I was looking at a 17-year-old. You know that scene in the Titanic, the start of the movie, where she starts to tell the story? That's what it was like. I would see a little girl at the dawn of life. And I would hear these just almost unbelievable stories, and these people stopped telling their stories for so long. They would cry as they told me these things. It was like the dam was breaking, because 2 reasons is. One is they were horrible. It wasn't all resilience. There was some really awful stuff. The suicide rate went up, the birth rate went down. People actually, the first time in our country's history, the birth rate actually went into negative territory. As I said, some people gave up their children. They didn't feel they could raise them. So these stories start pouring out, and they haven't told them for a half a century or more, because it seems unfathomable in our age, where we have the entire universe in our cell phones, that this stuff could be going on, and there are people alive that we can look into their eyes now. They're not photographs. They're not sepia-toned images. They're living human beings. You could sit down with them, and they lived in a sod house. They lived in a dugout. They ate roadkill. This was the time before Social Security. It was the time before farm price supports. So I felt so gifted to be able to, I felt like I just had this baton of a story handed to me. And I was like, don't screw it up. So what we know about the Dust Bowl, we know mostly from Steinbeck. That magnificent book, Grapes of Wrath, and pretty good movie with Henry Ford as well. But that was about the folks who left. And by the way, the second biggest location point for those Dust Bowlers, first biggest was the Central Valley of California. The second biggest, Eastern Washington. because of the Grand Coulee Dam. You know what the Grand Coulee Dam was called before it was called the Grand Coulee Dam? What the formal name was as the feds were drawing it up? It was called the Planned Promised Land. The Planned Promised Land. Because all these Dust Bowl refugees were going to come up from the barren part of this midsection of the United States where it was almost unlivable. And they're going to throw all this water from the backed up Columbia River onto what is now Moses Lake and beyond. And those people would settle there. Well, most of them ended up settling in the Yakima Valley. And you can go to the Yak Valley, as I did during my research, and find these fabulous so-called Okie festivals where they sing wonderful songs and eat food and talk about the old times. So this was the second biggest point for them. But the larger historical point is that the more important story of that Dust Bowl, the worst environmental calamity by far in our history, that happened in the worst economic collapse in our history, was 2/3 of the 3 million people living at the epicenter of this chaos, this complete breakdown of the natural world and the economic world. 2/3 of them didn't go anywhere. They stayed put in their homes, in their grass that they'd had. And so my jump-off point was, first of all, holy cow, these people are alive. I can get a story that hasn't been told. But secondly, what was it like? What was the texture of it like? What was your day like? What did you eat? How did you feel emotionally? Did you fall in love? Did you want to go to school? Did you go to church? All these sort of daily life things in a time that, again, in some ways is so distant. I mean, these people, some of them grew up in sod houses. I can't stress that enough. But it's still important to our time. So I love the title here, The Hope in Hard Times, because when I finished this book, I really didn't think anyone was going to want to read it because it's called The Worst Hard Time. Happy Valentine's Day, honey. And I had some other things that I can't repeat that people said about the title as well. But I said, I think if they stay with the story, they'll actually see a very powerful story of hope, of strength, of resilience, of overcoming the most extraordinary things that life can throw at you. And so I'd found a huge audience for this book, and I think people have. So let me go through the way I saw this thing. The first part of it being the sort of parable of the earth. Now, the American grassland is the second biggest ecosystem in the Western Hemisphere. You look at the entirety of the Great Plains, what was called the Great American Grassland. Only the arboreal forest of the north of Canada is a bigger ecosystem. Walt Whitman called it that delicate miracle, the ever-recurring grass. It was waist-high blue stem. It was the short, resilient buffalo grass. And over this eternity, this ocean of grass roamed up to 60 million bison. And these are ungulates, a biologist will tell you, and they were also a perfect food source for people who lived there. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Apache. Although the Apache were mostly roamers who came up from the southwest, mostly the Comanche were so-called lords of the plains. There were 12 bands of Comanche, and they actually developed a sign language. The one thing you realize as a Northwesterner going down there, first of all, there are no trees. Secondly, there are no mountains. I really felt disoriented as a Northwesterner being down there, but you also realize the wind never stops blowing. And one old timer said, well, of course it doesn't stop blowing, because if it ever did, all the chickens would fall down. I said, well, that's just what you tell the city people, isn't it? The Comanche had developed a sign language. They could communicate from a mile away, horse to horse, just by using different hand signals. That's how they learned to communicate with the wind. But they had bison. As long as you had bison, you can get all your food from that, your shelter and your food. Well, you know that story, and I probably won't dwell on it, but in little more than a generation's time, that bison herd of 60 million was gone. And in little more than a generation's time, all of those tribes who had roamed that area were pushed to small reservations, mostly in Oklahoma Territory, which was then the designated Indian Territory. So at the start of the 20th century, you had this conundrum for the American government, this big hole in America where nobody lived. They did a census, the 1900 census, and they found exactly 0 people living in the 8 counties of the North Texas Panhandle. It had been a giant ranch for a while. So they said, what do we do with this area? There are no more bison, there are no more Indians, there's grass. What do we do with this area? Well, they decided to double the Homestead Act. And what happened in the 20th century was the greatest surge in homesteading. I mean, everyone thinks the homesteading happened in the 19th century. Most of it was in the 20th century. From 1900 to 1917, the majority of land that was homesteaded during that period. So you could get a square mile, you and your wife. That's what happened when they doubled it. And what happened? They got the outcasts from all over the world. I call them the last chancers, people who never had a piece of dirt in their life. They had this wonderful subgroup. One of many subgroups I got entranced by were the Germans from Russia. They were pacifists, and they didn't want to pay taxes. So they'd been kicked out of Germany in the late 1780s, and Catherine the Great had welcomed them into Russia. And they settled on the Russian steppe. And then 150 or so years later, the Russian Tsar started drafting them and started taxing them. And so 250,000 of them picked up their communities from the Russian steppe and dropped them down like Dorothy's house on the American prairie. And they used the same titles of their towns. So you can go through the town of Catherinestadt in Kansas, and that's the Catherinestadt from Russia. You can go through the town of Pfeiffer, and that's the Pfeiffer from Russia. They just moved en masse, picked them up, dropped them down. 250,000 of them. They loved to sing. They loved to make sausage. They made great beer. And this is one thing I learned quite a bit about. They were neat freaks. So when the dust started to blow, it really got to them because they really wanted to keep a clean house. That was one of the groups that came. Second group, largely forgotten in the American story, Scotch-Irish. Now, I'm Irish Catholic, so the Scotch-Irish were all sort of planted by the Brits in my narrative of it. But they, in fact, were in the American South, and most of them had been the cannon fodder during the Confederacy. Not the slave owners, but the so-called poor white trash. These are the people that fought and died for the Confederacy. After the Confederate War, they had nothing. They're roaming around the South, and then their kids are the ones who moved to the Dust Bowl. For the first time in their life, these so-called poor white trash, these Scotch-Irish, are going to the midsection of America, and they're getting something. So they came out here, these Germans from Russia, had with them, when they sailed to America, sewn into their vest pockets, the seeds of what is turkey red wheat, what would become the wheat that could grow on the Great Plains in drought conditions. Also, incidentally, they didn't plan on this, were seeds called Russian thistle, tumbleweeds. So this symbol of the American West is not from the American West at all. It's an invasive weed from the Russian steppe that they accidentally brought here, and it took off like crazy. The accursed tumbleweed you see along the lines of the fences, all of that is from those seeds that came over in the vest pockets of these people from the Russian steppe. So for a while, times were good. They started with their sod houses, and they started with their dugouts, which were, you'd go 4 feet below the ground. I still saw a lot of these, earthen floor, and about 4 feet above ground, timbered roof, but earthen floor below. And your door was always facing to the south, because the coldest winds came from the north. So they lived in these dugouts, they lived in these sod houses, and they prospered. Wheat went from 25 cents a bushel to $1 a bushel to $2. World War I broke out. The only exporter of wheat at the time was Russia, and they got blocked in the area that we're all looking at right now in the Black Sea because of Crimea. That was blockaded by World War I, so America became a net wheat producer, exporter for the first time. The U.S. government said, plant more wheat, and that started this gold rush on the prairie. People who would never give a second thought to farming showed up in Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas. They called them suitcase farmers. And they showed up with their suitcases, went out, claimed their square mile, had the ground cleared of this glorious grass, put their turkey red wheat in the ground, and then came back in the spring and harvested it because it was dryland wheat. They relied on a little bit of rain, that's all it needed. So there was the equivalent of a gold rush for wheat. And it did double, quadruple. It got up to $4 a bushel. And that, not adjusted for inflation, for those of you who follow farm commodity prices, is almost what it's been in the last 10 years at different times. So people prospered. There was a wheat farmer in Kansas who said she made more, her name was Ida Watkins. She said, I made more last year than Babe Ruth did. So it all looked like it was going to happen. And these families that had never had anything before in their life had something. The land was good. It gave them something. So what happens, of course, now I have to give you this one caveat. In the 1820s, the American government sent a couple of land surveyors out to look at this territory when they were looking at the greater American sea-to-sea continent. And they came back and they said that this part of the United States, quote, this is in 1820, is wholly uninhabitable by a people dependent on agriculture. Now, they didn't say it was uninhabitable. They just said it's uninhabitable if you depend on agriculture for it. Grassland, good. So you had these ranchers who basically were doing what the Indians had done. They relied on the grass to feed their cattle, feed their horses. They had some big ranches. They thought it was all fine as long as you didn't turn it over. They hated the sodbusters. They didn't like those people turning the grass over because that was taking stuff away from them. So in a very short time, this wonderfully prosperous story of the American dream, of immigrants coming from all over, of people coming from the poor white South, started to change. In one sense, this is an economic story. Wheat got up to $4 a bushel. Wheat went down to a dime a bushel. They had overproduced. Russia, post-World War I, started to export again. They couldn't give the stuff away. So the wheat sat at these little train terminals. Every 10 miles, there was a town along the train tracks, and the wheat sat there, and nobody would purchase it. It had nowhere to go. So people started to abandon, two things happened. People started to abandon some of the farms. These suitcase farmers, who were only in it for $1, took off. Land was barren. They'd taken the grass off. They took off. The others who were there to stay, the immigrants who were going to put a stake in it, they had to double and triple and quadruple how much they would produce just to pay their banknote. So you had this last great plow-up. I call it the Great Plow-up. This final surge in the late 20s to try to cover what had happened. Now, a couple of side notes, because we're Northwesterners, and this was foreign to me. There's no water down there. I mean, they have a couple of little anemic rivers that look to us like, you know, the trickle that runs down Country Homes Boulevard here. That's considered a major river. I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone. I always said, you call that a river? How did you get water? Well, everyone told me this wonderful story. You'd order a windmill kit from Sears and Roebuck, and then you go down to the train depot, you get your windmill kit, you go out to your square mile, you put the thing in the ground, and pump would go down, and 10 feet below ground was the Ogallala Aquifer, a great lakes of fresh water that lies just below the plains. Boom, up comes water. You've got enough water for your garden to feed your livestock and make a go of it. So they had water came from the ground, and they could take care of most of their needs. Now, as the collapse in wheat prices happened, the Great Depression then happened. 1929, most historians date the Depression to the collapse of the stock market. It was basically two big collapses in October of 29. When it was all over, about 43% of the market value had been lost. But only 2% of Americans owned any stock in 1929. Now it's something like 67% when you account for everyone's 401ks. So you're sitting out in Kansas or Oklahoma or Texas and you go, screw those people in New York. I don't own any stock. Who cares? Well, the reason you cared was the banks were unregulated. And every town had a little bank then. They had taken out loans from these banks to expand their holdings. What did the banks do with their savings? They bet on the stock market. You can't do that now. Well, you could in the last economic collapse, I guess. We did change that rule, didn't we? I forget what it was called. Glass-Steagall. We changed that rule, and I don't want to go into that. But what happened was the banks had bet their money on the stock market. So when the stock market collapsed, the banks all went under. 4,000 banks went under in the Great Plains in 2 years' time. I have a scene in the book where people show up just to complete shock. The bank is shuttered, and they bang on the door, and they said, let us in. It's all of our savings in there. And they're gone. They're gone. And there's no FDIC. There's no recourse. They have your money. They put it on the stock market. That's liquid. That's vapor. That's gone. So the stock market collapse did affect you. The economic collapse did affect you. So now you can't get any money for the wheat you're growing, which you were getting $4 a bushel. Now you can't give it away. This is early 1930, 1931. And the savings that you've put together after all this hard work in your sod house, rising to a timber frame house, buying a piano, sending your daughter off for piano lessons, having nice clothes to go to Sunday school, all that stuff has disappeared in the bank collapse as well. And so the economic collapse does affect you. And just as it affects everyone else, 25% of Americans are out of work, 1 in 4. Now remember, Social Security happens in 1935, so there is no Social Security. If you're elderly, you're really at risk. And people wrote letters to Franklin Roosevelt, said, Mr. President, I don't know what to do. I don't have any children. I have nowhere to go. I'm hungry. They were destitute. They had no recourse. And just as this is happening, this horrible collapse of your dreams, the land starts to turn on you. Now, they had abandoned a lot of this stuff where the grass had been turned over. This is the parable part of it. And other parts of it they couldn't give away. Now, the winds have always blown in the southern plains. It's not unusual to have high winds, especially in the spring and the fall. Droughts, they always have had droughts. They can look at tree rings and see that over the course of 700 years, there have been far worse droughts than the 10-year drought of the 1930s. What was different in the 1930s? There was no grass. There was no grass. So I have a quote from a wonderful guy that I got to know really well named Milt White. His dad's name was Bam. Just wonderful names, Milt and Bam. And they were half Apache and half Anglo, and they were cowboys. I called them cowboys, Indians who were cowboys. And they loved to graze horses on what was left of the XIT ranch on the Texas Panhandle. And there's a scene where Bam's dad is looking out over this wasteland, this blowing soil, and he says to his son, wrong side up. And that, if you want to know, if those of you who are writing your college or high school papers on it, that in a nutshell is the story of the Dust Bowl. Wrong side up. That this grass that had taken thousands and thousands of years to evolve through this ecosystem and been turned up, it took to the sky. There's nothing to hold the ground in place. So when the drought came and those winds came, boom, it just took off. And they didn't know what this was. They had no institutional memory. They'd moved all the Indians off. There was nobody who'd lived there more than 30 years. They couldn't go say, do you have any records of this before? What is going on here? They had no institutional memory. This was Mars to them. They had come from all over the world, settled this thing. They didn't know what was going on. At first, the storms were curiosities. You would see a duster approaching. It wasn't quite the blackening thing yet, but it was a pretty good-sized thing. They learned to put towels under their door, over your window. When they say when you woke up in the morning, I heard this so many times from people, what you would see on your pillow was a little outline of where your head had been. And everyone turned over their pots and pans at night. They had these pretty paper-thin walls. In some cases, literally newspapers on them. I remember a guy telling me I would read the comics in this New York Yankees box scores from 3 years ago, on the wall of my house. And the dust always penetrated. It always penetrated. So then the storm started to increase. And in 1934, there was a storm that moved all the way, it was 1,400 miles long, they measured, moved all the way through Chicago, dumped a ton of dust on New York City, which completely freaked them out. I read the New York Times versions of that dust storm dumping on Manhattan, and they said, as you would expect, people ran to their psychiatrists. What is going on? It's all about me. That storm blew dust out to sea, and then they really started to increase. The worst of all was Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. There's never been a bigger storm since. That storm I mentioned on Chicago dumped 6,000 tons of dust. It was measured on Chicago. Black Sunday, according to the United States Geological Survey, had the equivalent of all the dirt that was dug out of the Panama Canal, which took 7 years to build, was thrown to the sky in one day. It started on the Canadian border up in the Dakotas. It rolled all the way down the American midsection, When it hit Denver, completely blackened Denver. Came through, they would telegraph and radio and phone ahead and say, it's a-coming, it's a-coming. And what it was, there's good documentary pictures of this, and if you haven't seen the Ken Burns film, there's some terrific footage of that. It was like the Rocky Mountain range was on the move itself. So some of these storms were 100 miles wide and a mile high. That's a mountain range of dust. And I remember one old timer told me, I said, they all remember this picture perfect because they remember it was a glorious sunny Sunday, just like today. And they thought, maybe this thing is over. They went out and they shook their clothes and they hung the fresh stuff on the lines and they went to church and they allowed themselves to be optimistic. They allowed themselves to think the worst is over. And when the thing came, I remember this one guy told me, now they always knew it would announce itself. These storms would announce themselves with static electricity. So before you actually saw it, the electricity was in the air. So if you had a car, you would ground the electricity with a little chain you carried. And they say when you shook another person's hand, it was a strong jolt from the static that would precede these storms. But one guy said it was like 2 midnights in a jug, which is a marvelous description. And I don't know how many times I heard this. The first time I heard it, I thought it was totally BS. But a guy said, no, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you hold out your hand, you could not see your hand. I go, oh, come on, what do you think I am? Your grandpa walked to school 14 miles. But I heard this time and time again, and then I saw the actual footage. You couldn't see your hand at a midday, April day, just like today. You could not see. That's how dark it was. Now, Black Sunday rolled all the way down. We got down into the Texas Panhandle, went into Amarillo, Texas, where a young songwriter, guitarist by the name of Woody Guthrie went into this little hut with a single light bulb hanging, shaking. And there were 12 women in here, and they said they were very religious, and they started shrieking that the end is near, God is killing us. Now, there was a lot of sort of biblical interpretations of these storms. People thought the end was near, and they thought it was God was punishing them because they got rich for a while and got greedy, and this was their comeuppance. But they started shrieking, the end is near, and Woody Guthrie penned a song, So Long, It's Been Good to Know Ya. And that became one of his better Dust Bowl songs. It's in the Ken Burns film as well. That storm moved into the Gulf Coast, moved along the Gulf, crept up the East Coast. So by Wednesday morning, President Roosevelt could go like this on his desk in the White House and see a little piece of Oklahoma. And the Congress was then considering the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, and it went completely dark. And Hugh Bennett, who was the person trying to promote the Soil Conservation Service, said, look outside. That's what I'm talking about. There goes the state of Texas. And they approved the Soil Conservation Service, which to this day is the lasting grassroots legacy of the New Deal. All the other parts sort of gave way, but that's the lasting grassroots legacy of the Soil Conservation Service. So in the midst of this physical chaos, what was it like to live in this time? Well, people ate tumbleweed, which was one of the few things that cursed Russian thistle. They gave it to their animals initially, and then they would eat it themselves. They brined it. I saw some of this. They brined it and kept it in a jar, and it was a source of protein for them. There was a town in the Oklahoma Panhandle that sent a telegraph. This is Boise City, Oklahoma. They pronounce it Boise City. It looks like Boise City. And they sent a telegraph to Washington, D.C., said, entire town in state of semi-starvation. Please help. So it was rock bottom. It was about as low as you could get. When that storm hit, by the way, people were crawling along. The layer of the dust would go all the way down to about a foot. So you could just see a foot or so. And the way you find your way, people told me, was you'd crawl along that little bit where it hadn't been blackened. Now, the big question was, man himself had become a force of awful geology. People say there is no climate change. This was climate change. This was human beings changing the climate. We changed in the midsection of the United States. An area the size of Pennsylvania was an entire wasteland, lifted of all its topsoil. Nothing would grow there. So the question is, what could you do? President Roosevelt, who was elected with 75% of the support in Oklahoma and Texas. The political parties have completely flipped now, but they were all strongly Democratic then. Roosevelt went to the Dust Bowl. One of the first things he did after Prohibition had been lifted in 32 when he was elected, and he went in 33 when he was after he was inaugurated, he came out to the prairie. There's a sign I saw. A bunch of guys come out in overalls and their wives, and they're just asking him, what, you got to help, what can you do for us? And then one guy holds up a sign that says, Mr. President, you gave us beer, now give us water. And Roosevelt said that the beer was the easy part. And it turned out it was. They tried a whole bunch of things for the next 10 years to fix the Dust Bowl. One of the things was they planted trees. So Roosevelt thought if he could bring this giant shelter belt down where the worst hard times were, people could farm between the shelter belt that would protect him. So they sent these civilian conservation workers out, and the towns liked this because if you were an 18-year-old girl, suddenly there's some 21-year-old guy from New York City living in your town. And they had money, too. It was a federal payroll, so suddenly money's coming into your community. So there are all these accounts of these young men from the cities living in their camps, a mile away from the small town, and they planted trees. Over the course of 10 years, they planted 220 million trees. And when I first started my research, I would just be flabbergasted. I'd be driving around going, what the heck is that thing? You'd see a little row of sort of spectral trees, just barely holding on, in a neat row, in a place that's otherwise an entire wasteland, but in a perfectly neat row in a way that nature never could have done. You go, what the heck are those things doing there? That was left over from the Roosevelt plan to plant trees, 220 million of them. At one point, they had a Dust Bowl summit, and this is kind of black humor. They invited the Indians who had been moved out of there, some Comanche, some Kiowa, and they actually asked them, this was in the minutes I saw of the meeting of the Dust Bowl summit, if the Indians would like to have their land back. Which, and they look, they're like, are you kidding? Thanks. You took good care of it, didn't you? Now, people ask me, do you blame the folks who live there? I have a very strong answer on that. No, I do not blame the people who live there because they were heroic for putting up with this. They were heroic for trying to go there in the first place. They were heroic for living through this. The government had induced them to come there by the free land, by the doubling of the Homestead Act. In addition, the railroads wanted to fill this area. The trains could not make money going from coast to coast. They wanted to fill the vast interior. So they platted a town every 10 miles. They went to Europe and hauled these banners all over Europe trying to get immigrants to move to the Great Plains, and they would give them bonus money to move there. So there was an inducement by both private industry from the trains and the railroads, and an inducement from government. They told them to live there, they told them to plant more wheat, they told them to dig up the grassland. And then when it turned on them, was it their fault? I mean, these people were so lonely. Some of the women, especially, you read some of the letters about how lonely they were. They were alone. They had these dust lunacy trials where you would be out there and the woman would say, I just can't take it anymore. The wind just keeps blowing. It would break them down mentally. Now, why didn't they get out? If 1 million of them got out, why did 2 million of them stay behind? Well, there's two answers to that. One is that when you're in the middle of something like this, you don't know you're in the middle of it. We may be in the middle of something right now, as far as climate change is going, and we don't know where it's going. And people will look back on us in 2014 and say, why didn't you guys do something about that? Well, we didn't know. Well, they thought this thing would end. They'd never seen anything like it before. They were called tomorrow people. The only thing they had left in the bank was a belief that tomorrow would be better. So they thought this thing has to end. The second reason was actually a third reason, but the second reason was that, as I mentioned earlier, they'd never had anything before in their life. This is the first time in a multi-generation saga of a single family that they had a piece of dirt. They had a piece of ground. Now, Steinbeck's people were transient farmers. They were tenant farmers, mostly in Missouri, by the way. Arkansas, Missouri, the wetter eastern parts of the Dust Bowl. These people were in the drier midsection of it, and they owned something. And they'd be damned if they were going to give up something after owning it. And the third reason was they got these letters back, not necessarily from Washington State, but certainly from California, telling them that they were being treated like crap. That there were signs in California at the border, you can see them, I'm not making this up, say, Okies turn back. You go into a restaurant and say, Okies and dogs, use back door. People said, why don't you all go back to where you came from, as if they came from some part that wasn't from the United States. They were treated terribly in parts of the Central Valley. They weren't welcomed in parts of these areas. The state troopers would harass them. So the letters back home to some of the folks who were sticking it out were that, hey, it isn't necessarily any better here than where you are, so stick it out. So what happened? Did they fix the Dust Bowl? Well, after 10 years, they had started to adjust with some conservation measures. They'd started to contour plow. They'd started to put furrow lines in the direction that the wind goes, which does seem fairly obvious. They rested a lot of the land. A lot of the land became national grasslands. So if you go there now and you look at the map, you'll see here's the Comanche National Grassland of 4 million acres. You go, what the hell is this? Well, that's the former Dust Bowl that's now run by the Forest Service. That's a national grassland. And there's some irrigation agriculture. There's some wheat that's come back. But by and large, it's emptied out. They have less people now than they had 100 years ago in most of those counties. And so you just have a handful of people left telling their stories. And that's really where I came in. I was a person looking for a story, and everyone wants to tell your story. I've learned over a lifetime of journalism that there's people who tell you they don't want to tell you their story, but they do. We are a storytelling people. We want to pass on to our children. They kept fabulous diaries, told fabulous stories in their letters because they wanted. I have a diary of a man. Most of my subjects were women because women outlive men and because they're, I hate to say this, way more articulate. The women would say, yes, I remember it perfectly. It was a Sunday afternoon and I had something on the pot. And men would say, well, it was bad. And that would be it. I just had to sit there and talk to this guy for 2 hours while he crossed his arms and told me it was bad, you wouldn't understand. So I found a diary of a man, a guy named Don Hartwell. There's 3 chapters in the book where I just run the diary. And it's great because he starts out as a typical man. Diary entry, July 16th, he was listening to baseball games. He would say, Yankees lost again, good. And actually it's reassuring to know people hated the Yankees as much then as they do now, which I found really, and then he would record the weather, like who cares whether it was 67 degrees that day, 70 years later. And then as time went on, he would start to say something about himself. He had no children. He would say, I just don't know how much more I can take. My wife and I are drifting apart. A year later, my wife now took a job as a maid in the city of Denver for a doctor. I don't think I'll ever see her again. 2 months later, bank took the land today. So it was a slow breakdown of how a man lost his sense of being a man, lost his sense of masculinity, his pride. And I was very happy from a storytelling perspective to get that. So I want to conclude with the storytelling part of this. There's a woman named Jeannie Clark who was the first person I met when I was doing my research. I went to this little town in southeastern Colorado, because that part of Colorado is not the Rocky Mountain High, it's the high plains. And I went to this tiny little town and went into this antique store and found this woman who was sitting next to an oxygen cylinder. And I said, do you know anyone who was around in the dirty 30s? Anyone who could tell me what it was like during the Dust Bowl? And she said, well, pull up a seat. And that was my introduction to Jeannie Clark, and it turned out she had a fabulous story. Her mother was a Broadway dancer in New York City. And because the air was so crappy and everyone smoked then, she had respiratory problems. The doctors sent her to Kansas for the air. And it turned out they all got dust pneumonia, nearly died in the air. But as life often happens, this Jeannie Clark met a cowboy, fell in love with him, got married, and ran a bar, and lived a happy old life. I tell her story in The Worst Hard Time. About a year after the book came out, she called me up and she was just breathless. I said, Jeannie, what's going on? She said, well, you just wouldn't believe what's happening. I said, what? She goes, well, all these little kids are showing up and knocking on my door. They want to do their school projects on me. They want to hear my story. She goes, and you know what? The Rotary wants me to speak down there. And she said, Tim, you know, you've made me like a rock star. And I was so happy. She died about 6 months later. I was so happy because it's when I said that they had stopped telling their stories because they didn't think anyone would believe them. And that's why I'm so glad you're doing this show now, because you can look and see, get a little bit of a sense what it was like, and it gives you a sense on our own perspective. We just have gone through a very hard recession. I will not minimize what it's done to people who lost their homes, lost their jobs, but you can't put it in any sense next to what happened in the 30s, you know, where it just really was. I mean, our life problems now are I should say, our sort of comfort problems are minimal compared to those. We were talking about survival. Take a look at those pictures of those people. You will see people look like they walked out of Auschwitz. You'll see people, they're concave, they're very scrawny. It really was awful. So I feel good. And for those of you who have folks, grandfolks, siblings even, who lived through that time and are alive, I just lost my mother a year ago, and my daughter sat down and ran a tape recorder for 3 days, and it's wonderful stuff. World War II stuff mainly. Meeting a GI husband, all the stuff I didn't know anything about, having an affair. Mom, you shouldn't have said that part. But I think that if you have people who are alive from that era, get their story. Get their stories, because it's your story. It's your family story. Don't let it slip away. Thank you. So we have time for some questions. I'm allowed about 15 minutes, and I'm happy to answer anything and everything, as long as it's sort of on topic. We're going to have a very energetic young man run a microphone up to you. I think he has tenure as well.
Well, Mr. Bernanke stated that it was the Federal Reserve's fault. They overheated the economy and then...
No, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble hearing you. Maybe...
I don't think it's on. Mr. Bernanke has stated that the Depression was the fault of the Federal Reserve. They allowed the economy to overheat, and then they had to slow it down. To a certain extent, is that true, or do you think that was...
Boy, that's a tough macroeconomic question. Bernanke said they allowed the economy to overheat. I mean, there's sort of some neo-analyses of what caused the Depression. I mean, the stock market was one of the it always gets the consensus view as the starter of the Great Depression. But I don't think, we had the Roaring '20s, which preceded that, and there was a lot of overvaluation of commodities and products. So I think there's a fair argument that it did overheat. It certainly overheated on the stock market because they were selling worthless stocks for 100 times their value. Boy, that never happens, does it? The one thing I think, I'll just give you this one economic point, it's one of my pet peeves, is they did learn some economic lessons from the Great Depression. One was to not let banks dabble in the stock market unless they had an amount of money that was investor saver money they could compensate if they lost that money. So if they lost it on the market, they had to have insurance or something else to pay you. Then we passed this stupid getting rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, which directly, in many ways, led to this last recession because people had these fancy collateralized debt obligations, all these things that no one understands that largely happen on Wall Street that affected all of us because they pulled out some of the regulatory brakes that had been put in after the Depression. And that really bothered me, but don't get me started on that. Because they learned an economic lesson. They said, at the very least, let's make sure banks have adequate capital to cover their investors' losses. They're not put it all in the stock market. And then they threw that aside. They said, oh, well, this will never happen. We'll cover you. So we had to bail out the banks.
I was in Montana just after your book, The Worst Hard Times, came out, and I met a gentleman who is a corn farmer in the Midwest, and we talked about your book. And he said, oh, that'll never happen again because of the way we do agriculture nowadays. But it looks to me like there's a lot of plowing under of land for soy and corn. And could this happen again with?
You know, those who say that'll never happen again are almost hubristically asking nature, you want a piece of me? You know? Just before the big burn, the fire I wrote about, the greatest wildfire in American history, burned 3 million acres, an area the size of Connecticut, in 36 hours. Just before that happened, the head of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, said, fire is now something we can completely control. I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, but I would never say it can never happen again because I get emails every single day from China or Australia of people showing me Australia and giant dust storms, or China where the desertification is just creeping down on their already horrible air. You know, Beijing's unlivable, and the expanding desert is coming down, and I get these emails, people saying, does this look familiar? And so, yeah, but to his question about the farming, we have improved farming practices, dramatically so. And that's largely because the Soil Conservation Service got people voluntarily, it's not a government thing, it's people who live in the districts helping each other to see the land as a whole instead of my patch against your patch. And we rest certain lands. Now the farmland program has gotten so chaotically out of what it was originally intended to do. It was supposed to help farmers who were on their last leg. Now it helps millionaires ensure that they have good Hawaiian vacations. But the farming that will produce that, I was down in the southern part of the California Central Valley 2 months ago. As you know, California is having its worst drought in their recorded history. And I saw road signs outside of Fresno saying, the new Dust Bowl. Well, it's not anywhere near a Dust Bowl, but it is happening. And it's because it's an artificial construct. California relies on water to the Sierra, which they send down there. And so that's, you know, it wasn't intended to be farmed the way it is. But I think if you say it'll never happen, you're not willing to learn from the lessons of what caused that. I think we have over here.
Well, thanks for a marvelous talk, and
Thank you.
And I enjoyed reading your book. I happened to be a kid that was 10 years old in Dalhart at the time of this Bowl, and losing my voice, but. It was exciting, like you said, the big black storm. My brother is pumping me on a bicycle. We caught my pants, and we didn't have any money. We lived in a little green candy store. So he cut my pants, and we went home, survived inside this shelter, like you were describing. But one thing I wanted to bring up was that not too far away from Dalhart is a place called Buffalo Springs, and it happened to be the headquarters for the XIT Ranch, which was about a 2 million acre ranch. And when I was a kid, there used to be an artesian well that came up, you know, water was huge. And I went back for a 50-year anniversary not too long ago, and it was just maybe a little kind of trickle of nothing. So it pointed out that the Ogallala Aquifer, which all that area from there all the way up to Canada, is really being depleted. We don't hear much about it, but there are water issues that are super important to all of us.
Right. Well, thank you. And for several things. First of all, hats off to a citizen of Dalhart. I spent a lot of time there. I'm going to tell you one quick side story, and then I'm going to answer your question. I'm ready to go to your point. I forgot to mention, in Dalhart, Texas, they were so sick of the bad press they were getting in these newsreels, they started something called the Last Man's Club, where you took a card and you signed your name and you agreed, you come hell or high water, you would be the last man to leave Dalhart. And I mentioned Bam White, the half Apache, half Anglo. When he died, they found a Last Man's card still in his wallet, but the founder of the Last Man's Club, who was a big promoter and newspaper guy, he fled town as soon as he got a good job. So I actually got a call from his granddaughter, was really upset. And I said, well, he did leave, didn't he? She goes, yes, but he had a good opportunity. I said, well, all right. Now, that's a great point. I wrote about that in my New York Times column this week about the Ogallala Aquifer. Most people don't know about this. There's a Great Lake. It's 2 billion acre feet of water, okay? An acre foot is an acre covered a foot deep, 2 billion acre feet of water. University of Kansas did a 4-year study. They released it last year. They said, we're drawing this thing down that by 2060, which is what, 46 years away, most of it will be depleted. It took millions of years for all the combined snow melt to come off the east slope of the Rockies, to trickle down through all that gravel, to create this wonderful body of fresh water, a sponge that underlays all of the Great Plains. And the part that you mentioned is already completely depleted. I spend a lot of time in the Texas Panhandle because I go down there to speak, and I did a lot of research down there. And they know they're doing it. They know it's going to be an uninhabitable marscape in about 20 years' time, but they just want to get theirs and get out. It's sad. They absolutely know they're doing it. They don't need Al Gore to come along and tell them they're doing it. They know they're doing it. They can see it like you can see it. So that's I think it's a tragedy. This is a huge body of water that underlies the Great Plains. That's how native people live. These little seeps and these artesian wells that would come up everywhere. And they're drawing it down. It's these giant pivot irrigator things you see that spit out water on these cotton that then goes to China to make cheap clothes that are sent back here. Yes, sorry. Yeah, that's the XL pipeline. I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. But yes, one of the concerns of the XL pipeline, some of the opposition has been from farmers, because if they had a bad spill, it would tend to pollute that aquifer. In some places, the aquifer is very shallow. It's 10 feet below the ground. Other places, it's 20, 100 feet. But if they had a giant spill of one of those pipelines, they're worried about that. So what is it, water or oil? I mean, do we have to make a decision on that? I think in front here, yes.
You mentioned California, and I would like to ask a question. When they had drought the last time, which wasn't this severe, they really depended on the Columbia. In fact, they called the Columbia River theirs. Are we shipping water down there again at the present time?
No, we're shipping electricity, though, which is sort of the same thing. Our electricity comes from water. And we have actually, the Northwest has the cleanest, most sustainable form of electricity of all, which is hydro. Doesn't put any CO2s into the atmosphere. And in the summers, when they're running their air conditioners and their electricity is low, BPA sends our surplus to them, or sells our surplus to them, but we don't ship water. There was a plan to actually, I'm not kidding, I saw this thing, to run a spigot off the Columbia River and send it down to California. California is the most amazingly constructed sort of fantasy state, because the whole thing is this giant plumbing scheme of running water from the Northern Sierra. LA would have about 100,000 people, about half of Spokane, if it hadn't stolen all that water from the north. Go see Chinatown if you want to know the story of water in Southern California, the movie. But no, to answer your question, we're not. One of their other schemes was they were actually, again, this is how crazy it was. They were going to chip off a bunch of icebergs in Alaska and haul them down to California, yes, and somehow get the melt off of that. I never understood it, but it was one of the schemes for a while. But no, they haven't diverted the Columbia River, just our electricity.
Well, follow-up comment. At that time, the last time that they had a drought, which it wasn't this severe, we had brownouts in Seattle, where we could only water twice a week, odd, even dates, so forth. Do you think there's a chance they're going to come after it again?
Well, I hope you don't mind this, but I actually, as a person whose lawn goes brown, I welcome those brownouts because my neighbors weren't mad at me for not watering my lawn. No, I don't know. I mean, until this big March came, we were setting them for brownout summer again. Because, snowpack is the name of the game for us. It's all what happens in the winter, and that's everything. I think we're going to be okay right now. We're at 130% of the snow melt right now. The Sierra, if any of you have been down to California, is absolutely bone dry. No snow this year. What they're going to have is wildfires, a lot of them. They're already having them. They're just living in fear right now of wildfires all over the place. And they're rationing water, too. So let's take one more question, then I'll sign some books. If you don't mind energetically bouncing up to the top there. Right.
So I teach American history, and I have my students write a family history paper, find their oldest relative and, interview them. And they're 16, 17 years old, they're not experienced journalists, but can you give me a couple of pointers for how to do that type of interview and get the sort of information that you were able to get out of your subjects?
Well, thank you for the question. Two things on that. One is, and I'll close on this, I am a big believer that there is no such thing as boring history. There's only boringly told history. That if you don't realize that narrative itself, all of us, our family narrative, our city narrative, our neighborhood narrative, our country narrative, the Indians have these things called creation myths. It's basically narrative. Where did you come from? How did your people get here? We all have our own creation myths. And that's what history is. It's narrative. I'm doing an Irish American book right now, and it's just fabulous to look at these stories of how people came out of the famine, which killed 1 million Irish in 5 years. The worst human rights atrocity, by the way, in the history of Europe until the Holocaust came along, because the Brits let it happen on their watch. But Butte, Montana is just full of famine Irish. You go to Butte, Montana, where Gaelic was the second language spoken for so long, and what you hear are stories of people who lost everything in the famine. So I'm a big believer in narrative as a powerful way to tell history. As far as interviews go, the only thing, and I have trouble with this myself because sometimes I just can't shut up, is if you just listen, sometimes, I learned this going to Native American communities where, Indians sometimes can be reluctant to talk to white outsiders. I just learned to shut up. Thank God I caught that. Because then people feel almost an obligation to talk. And I can just, you've traveled all this distance, you're there, and just ask it. Now, one of the tricks I had also was, again, with these damn men who didn't want to talk very much, I would get a little story from somebody else, and I'd come back. And I would say, the guy down the street tells me you were a real bastard in 1937. He says you stole his truck and took his, and he goes, he said that? And so a little prodding of a detail can often get you somewhere. So anyway, thank you for making me feel at home.